and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out on a cold day to the Oregon Area Senior Center. I'm Jill Wooten, the administrative assistant here. This is a pretty good crowd. I don't think we've had this many folks other than the holiday play. If you missed it, it was a shame. But we're happy to have you out. Today we have, I believe it's Michael Rehberg, is that how you say your name?
Yep.
From the Wisconsin Historical Society. He is going to talk to us about why do we call it that, which we were laughing. If you've ever listened to the weatherman mispronounce something, you're like, you're not from around these parts, are you? We have lots of interesting names, so it'll be interesting to hear why maybe we call it that.
As Jill said, I'm Michael. I come from Walworth County, and I work at one of the Wisconsin Historical Society museums, a house museum that's on Geneva Lake. And it's called Black Point Estate. I'll show you a picture of it, but it's closed at this time of the year. And one of our philosophies is, if we can't ask you to come to us, we should come to you. And so that's why, especially the winter time, we spend more time on the road, because that museum, that house museum, literally is just like it was in 1888 when it was built. It is without heat, and it was never intended to be used year-round. No insulation, no storm windows. And so since 1888, we put sheets over the furniture and pull down the drapes and say that's it for the year, just like the first owners did. It's kind of an extraordinary house, given that it was owned by 4 generations of the same family until it was given to the state of Wisconsin in 2005. But that's another whole story. Invite me back and we can talk about that some other time, or you come see us in the summertime when we're there. We should start with why do they call it that, with a little bit of a question about this place. Now, I lived in near Middleton for 20 years or so before I moved to other places. And I always said that this place was called Oregon, right? Oregon. Then I started traveling, and I went to the state of Oregon, and there they like to say that the way to remember it is to say you could have a pistol or a gun. They always like to say or a gun. Is that familiar? Is that about the way it is here too? More than the Oregon? Oregon? It's kind of puzzling. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about what we're up to for today. So, this program was originally built around Walworth County, where we live now. And then when I knew I was coming here, I said, well, that's not going to be as interesting. So I took out some of the boring parts about Walworth County and put in a bunch of interesting things about Dane County. So we'll talk a little bit about Walworth County, a little bit about Dane County today. And my title is Lead Interpreter at Black Point Estates. That's a title that means with somebody who has too much curiosity. And my job is to find stories to tell. And so that's kind of what we're doing today. Why do we want to talk about why do we call it that? Well, the names of the places tell us a good deal about who we were and what we were dreaming about and what we felt was important and what we hoped to see. And so there's lots of reasons why it's interesting to listen to or think about what do these place names, where do they come from? Of course, the first Europeans were French, explorers, Nicolet, Marquette, Joliet. And so guess what? We have cities, places that are French in origin, including a place where I grew up in Racine County. Racine is the French word for, anybody know?
Rice.
Route. Right, the Route River goes through the middle of Racine. Yeah. Prairie de Chine, dog of the prairie. Fond du Lac, bottom of the lake. You know, all those French words. After 1800s, a lot of the settlers in this area came from New England and the mid-Atlantic states. So we, in my area, have words like Burlington, Caledonia, Rochester, and whoops, is there another one? There it is. Went too fast. Americans were here first, and this is the one that Jill and I were joking about earlier, is the first time I went through a parade on the square in Madison, and the band had a big banner out front, and my wife said, "Where's Macunago?"
Oh, my, yeah.
Yeah, right. Well,
Right.
Waubesa, Oconomowoc, Menominee Falls, all those Indian names, Native American names. And then later on, we see more settlers coming from what we call the Old Country, or Europe. And so we see New Trier and New Berlin, except we call it New Berlin, and all those kinds of things. Some names are too easy. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time asking you which direction West Road goes. All right? You can probably guess what color the water is in white water. All right? So we won't deal with those. We could start with this one. Why is the state called Wisconsin? Well, it's named for the river. That's pretty obvious. I could have told you that. Well then, why is the river called Wisconsin? The river is headed in Vilas County, 40 to 50 miles long, and empties into the Mississippi south of the Prairie du Chien. So it's one of the major highways that the fur traders, the French fur traders, used to get throughout Wisconsin. Nobody knows why the river is Wisconsin. Certainly the Indians named it first. Father Marquette wrote in his journals that it was Wisconsin, and it probably meant red stone, characteristic of the banks. Hennepin called it Wisconsin. He thought it meant strong currents or wild rushing waters. French people spelled it with an O-U-I at the beginning of it, Wisconsin. That's the way the Potawatomi were pronouncing it. And that meant holes in the bank of a stream where the birds nest, or it meant muskrat lodge, or where it gets cold, or a good place to live. So you can pick your name about why they chose the river named Wisconsin. And it's been difficult to spell. All during the 17th century, we had lots of examples of different ways to spell the same word. 18th century wasn't much better. And it wasn't until Wisconsin became a state in 1845, territory in 1845, that the territorial legislature nailed down the spelling the way we are familiar with it now. In the Northwest Territory, of course, is where Wisconsin came from. And in the Northwest Territory, Jefferson was thinking that these would be good names for the states. And these were Jefferson's original. So we might have been living in Michigania or Sylvania or Essenipipia or something like that. But we're lucky enough that Jefferson's names were not used, I guess. They sound pretty unfamiliar. But coincidentally, Dane County is named after Nathan Dane, who was a Massachusetts senator who wrote the ordinance about the Northwest Territory. So right away, we're acknowledging the Northwest Territory when we call the county Dane. What about Bigfoot Prairie? Bigfoot Prairie is south of Lake Geneva in an area where I live. It's kind of a striking story. There are lots of the prairies and lots of the prairie busting, sod busting projects here. But there are stories in that area where the 6 yoke of oxen would pull one bottom plow and go 2.5 miles before they turned around. To get a feel for some of the geography of Wisconsin, 2.5 miles before they turned around. Well, you may know it was named after the Indian chief who lived on what we call Geneva Lake. Guess what? He didn't call it that. He called it Bigfoot Lake. He was a leader in the 20s and 30s, and look at how he shows up on Indian treaties. In the Treaty of Green Bay, he signs his name as Mon Yizit. Now, actually, he didn't sign his name, of course. He wouldn't have known how to create or write English letters, but the interpreters wrote his name that way. In 1829, the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, he signed it Mauguizet. And in 1833, he appears as Mangiset. 1833 treaty is the important one. Remember Black Hawk War, 1832, last war on this side of the Mississippi. Then in 1833, all the Indians go to Chicago and with a belly full of whiskey agree they'd rather live on a reservation in Kansas.
Well, I don't think they really agree. I
Pardon?
mean, a little coercion going on there.
That would a little coercion. Yeah, I would say. It's one of the sad stories of our history, I'm sure. By 1836, then, all in southeast Wisconsin, all the Indians were either had left or were hauled off on military wagons to reservations, Kansas and Missouri. The post office was established in August of 1838. We called it the Bigfoot Post Office. Now we call it the Lake Geneva Post Office. Ashton, a little town north of Middleton, was interesting for me to learn about. Named for Thomas Ashton, president of the British Immigration Society, an organization in Britain that brought over 1,000 families to settle this part of the country from Lodi to Mineral Point in the 1840s and 50s. It's interesting that these temperance immigration societies, temperance goes all through early Wisconsin. Really quite a struggle over the whole thing. Look at, for example, Walworth, the county that I was talking about earlier. Well, where did the name Walworth come from? Well, it's named in honor of Reuben Walworth, a temperance leader from New York. So Walworth County also celebrating the temperance concept. Samuel Phoenix and Walworth were both active in the American Temperance Union and both active in abolishing slavery as well. Another big question early on. Delavan, another town in my area, founded by Sam and Henry Phoenix and dedicated to temperance, religion, and the abolition of slavery. The deeds, the early deeds in Delavan all required you to agree to never consume or sell to someone who did consume alcohol. Now those are illegal constrictions now, but that's the way it was started. That's how Delavan started. And named in honor of Edward Delavan of New York, who was the founder of the Temperance Union. Samuel also had Walworth County, as I said, named for Walworth 2 years later. So we have streets in our area called Temperance Trail. Right down the street from a bar, by the way. But that's also part of that struggle that Wisconsin had in those days. Delavan Lake, we think of as from that same area, but the whole chunk called it Turtle Lake. Potawatomi, Wabisha Bees, Swan Lake. Does that sound familiar? Wabisha, Swan Lake. And maybe we ought to call it Romeo and Juliet Lake. As you may know, Delavan was the winter headquarters of a lot of circuses, and Romeo and Juliet were two of the circuses, two of the elephants that came from the island of Ceylon, Sri Lanka. And Romeo was just a devastatingly terrible animal. 19.5 feet tall, 10,500 pounds, killed 5 handlers and 25 horses in his circus career. And Juliet, from the same herd, came also from India, died in Delavan in the middle of the winter. What do you suppose you do with a dead elephant in the middle of the winter? You cut a big hole in the ice and you drop her in. And that's what they did. And fishermen years later would keep pulling up elephant bones from there. So that's why Delavan Lake maybe should be called Romeo and Juliet. It turns out that Romeo died a couple of years later in Chicago, but in the summertime. So they took him to the landfill. Everybody know why Sun Prairie is named Sun Prairie? Well, in 1837, there's a bunch of people leaving Milwaukee, 6 yoke of oxen, carrying supplies to build Madison's first capital. They traveled 9 days in the rain and the mud. Get ready for this. Until the sun came out. So 9 days from Milwaukee to Sun Prairie, first day of sunshine. So what do you call the place? Sun Prairie. The name stuck. The only Wanakee in the world, originally in 1870, was Leicester. 1893 became Wanakee, a native phrase for fair and pleasant valley. Number of owners, early settlers gave land so that the railroad would show up there. The depot is on the National Register, and imagine 60 trains a day going through town at the height of the railroad era, including 14 passenger trains and the famous 400, the one that would go from Chicago to Minneapolis in 400 minutes.
Is Wanakee French?
No, it's Native American.
Oh, okay.
Fair and Pleasant Valley.
Oh.
I don't know exactly which tribe, but Native American. Anybody know? I'll give you a visual clue. Catfish. Yahara is a Native American name for catfish. And I don't know about you, but I think cats look a lot more attractive than catfish. Well, they have whiskers, I guess. Badger Mill Creek, this one had me stumped for a while. I learned about it in one of the books that I have listed in the handout that I'll give you at the end of the program. But I went to this map from 1890, and sure enough, just below Verona, Badger Mill Creek. I found it, so I knew I could tell you where it was. But if you were paying attention, you'd say, yeah, but where's the mill? Right? It was the first grist mill in the county, 1844. Well, I went to an earlier map, 1873, and sure enough, the Badger Mill shows up. So that's where it was. It's inside, near the gravel pits, inside Verona now, near the gravel pits, so it was very close. And of course, grist mills were very important. I'm going to show you in a minute one from Walworth County. Maybe it's next. Yeah. Genoa. Genoa was named in Wisconsin Genoa Junction was named in Wisconsin to keep it separate from Genoa, Illinois. It was founded on the Nippersink Creek, and he established a sawmill in 49 and a grist mill in 53. So about the same time as that Badger Creek one we were talking about. But that's a very typical procedure. Dam up the creek, build the sawmill, get enough lumber to build the grist mill to grind the flour and the corn. Right? That's kind of the typical way that a lot of these settlements came together. So there's the original town. And you can see in this case, the original town is down here, 23 blocks. It had a big mill pond, they put a dam across it. The river keeps going this way, and the mill race goes this way. I think there's a close-up. Yeah, there's the close-up. And sure enough, here's the flouring mill for this Genoa City. But Genoa City is much more famous for The Young and the Restless. Some of our favorite TV shows where this is the 49th season this year of this soap opera on TV, The Young and the Restless. And it takes place in Genoa City. They don't say Wisconsin, but Genoa City is its fictional place. I don't know if you got a chance to watch it this week, but one of the recent stories says that Sharon tells Nick that he's not Christian's biological father. Adam was the father, and Sharon has DNA evidence of the fact. So if you missed that part of the program, now you're all caught up. The program was originally written by people who lived on Geneva Lake, and this was their boathouse on Geneva Lake, and they called it Boat No Go, because of course it wasn't really a boat. We should talk a little bit about how that Geneva Lake got changed. Geneva Lake, as I said, was originally Bigfoot Lake. And this is a drawing. Go online and find this drawing yourself. That the surveyors turned into the surveying office in Cincinnati. John Brink was the surveyor in our area. And this is his rough drawing. Brink is from Geneva, New York. And he thinks this lake is so good looking and so attractive that it would be just a shame to call it Bigfoot Lake. So he changes the name on the drawing, and he gets into trouble for it because the Cincinnati Surveyor General has told him to use the original names, the native names. So if it's Turtle Lake, then you got to call it Turtle Lake. You're not supposed to call it Crystal Lake or something like that. Well, he got into trouble and got hollered at when he went back to Cincinnati for changing the name, but he was so homesick for his lake in upstate New York, so that he changed the name to Geneva. It was literally the post office, as I said, originally Bigfoot for a little while, then Geneva, and then in '82 it became Lake Geneva. And that's another interesting story, that the lake is always Geneva Lake. The village sitting next to it is Lake Geneva, or in the opposite order. Because when they were founded, the village was called Geneva. The train came along, and the train started shipping stuff to Geneva, Wisconsin that was supposed to go to Geneva, Illinois, and vice versa. So the train put the word lake in front of Wisconsin's Geneva on the timetable to keep it separate. And then the village said, well, we might as well do what the train did. And so they changed their village from being Geneva to Lake Geneva. So Lake Geneva is on the shore of Geneva Lake. Now, I always get them switched back. And sure enough, when Brick turns in his final drawing, he's changed the name from Bigfoot Lake to Geneva Lake. Always interesting on these old maps to look at the names of places. It isn't too hard in 1873 to see why that little part of the lake is called Nichols Point, because Mr. Nichols owns the property right there, right? Well, that's the point that ends up being the place where the beer brewer from Chicago builds Black Point Estate. And so on other maps it's called Black Point. But when the house was originally built, it was built on this high point of the mountain. And if any of you have been to Germany, the beer brewer was German. Are you surprised to hear that? When he built his house, he named it the Lorelei. And that's after the legend of the Lorelei on the Rhine River, where there's a magic mountain. You been there?
No.
But you know about it.
No.
Yeah, the Lorelei was a dangerous place in the river for sailors to manage because they got distracted by a beautiful maiden at the top of the hill who was combing her golden hair and singing her beautiful songs and distracting the sailors. So it's a legend, kind of like our Paul Bunyan legend here, but this was a German Rhine River thing. So when Conrad Seip built his house on his magic mountain on Geneva Lake, he called his place the Lorelei, until World War I came along. All things German became a little unfavorable. And so, submitting to public pressure, he changed the name of his estate from the Lorelei to Black Point, which is what the Native Americans had called it because it had a canopy of black oak trees. And so that's where the name comes from. And I hope you get to come to see us next summer. It's a Victorian cottage. As I said, never meant to be used in the winter. 13 bedrooms. Even has a bathroom right inside the building. 8,000 square feet. And stayed in the same family for 4 generations. Now, to think about that, I like to ask people, do you remember yourself? Yes. Do you remember your mother's first name? Yes. Do you remember her mother's first name? Yes. And then one more. Can you remember her mother's first name? Those are the 4 generations you'd have to keep in your head to realize how long this house stayed in the same family. It's really kind of extraordinary story on Geneva Lake.
And I'm looking at that long tower with the porch thing around it.
Yeah.
And they never went through a tornado, apparently.
We had some windy weather, but never a tornado. No, that's true. When we don't go there on tours, it's very dangerous. It's got a trap door and all the rest of that. It's very, very, very tall. But I like to say on tours that that would have been Grandma's cell phone. When she needed to know when the sailboat was going to come back, she could get up there and see most of the lake in front of her, figure out what's going to go on there.
That's right.
And then on a summer day, a hot summer day, it'd leave the trapdoor open, and it would behave like a chimney and kind of suck the hot air out of the house. Guess what? The house is not air conditioned.
Sure.
Next to Geneva Lake is another lake that I live on called Duck Lake. So of course I was curious about, well, why would it be called Duck Lake in 1857, which is when this map was done. And then it was changed to Lake Como, according to one history book in 1839 by Thomas McCaig, who was a surveyor who platted Lake Geneva. And sure enough, well, you can't read it from there, but I can tell you, honest, that's where Tom McCaig lived for most of his life, on that north shore of Lake, what he called Lake Como. Well, it turns out our famous surveyor did the same thing. Changed the name from the native Duck Lake and called it Como. And so when I search old newspapers and look for Duck Lake, I find lots of places where it's covered, it's talked about in newspapers, but when I search for Como, it's not there. Even though the surveyor labeled it Como, the local people called it Duck Lake for well into the 20th century, the 1900s. And I'm not surprised, because I don't suppose there were very many Potawatomi Indians who'd ever been to Italy and seen the original Como. But somehow Brink must have known about it. You get to 1891 and even the map makers don't know what to call it. How about Ryan's Lake? Well, same thing. Look, Mr. Ryan is owning the land, so he can call the lake whatever he wants. That's 1857. We also see 73 and 91, it's still the same. But when we get to 1920s, it's called Lake Ivanhoe. And Lake Ivanhoe was developed in 1926 for high-minded colored people, church-going, and people of education and refinement. All right, that's the good side of the story. The bad side of the story is they had to develop their own recreational area because Lake Geneva wouldn't invite them in. Lake Geneva was a sundown town. All the black people had to be gone by when the sun went down. Very popular place. It's still developed now as well. Here's one in the eastern edge, almost in Racine County, near Burlington. Maybe the craziest story in Wisconsin I've ever heard of. And I'll bet most of us don't know about it. Voorhee is the name of the town, and it was founded by Jesse Strang, 1844. And sure enough, there's a Mormon cemetery because it was a Mormon settlement in 1844. That's pretty early. Now, here's the history. Joseph Smith had his first vision in 1820. But of course, he and his brother were killed by a mob, and Brigham Young takes over. Now, Brigham Young takes over. And by the way, Jesse Strang was baptized by Joseph Smith. And this is Jesse Strang. It's as true as you can believe it. He was a lawyer. He converted to Mormonism 5 months before Smith was assassinated. He produced a letter that said Smith wanted him to be the leader, not Brigham Young. He named himself king. He held 2 terms in the Michigan legislature, was arrested for treason, conducted his own defense and was acquitted, and then he was shot in the back by disgruntled Mormons. Crazy guy. There's a new book out about a year ago called The Man Who Would Be King, I think it's called, about the Mormons, and it's really kind of crazy.
Sounds a little like Trump.
Oh, I'm not going to talk about that. Yeah, I think it does. So an angel comes to him in Burlington, Racine, Walworth County, and gives him a vision that says there are buried plates under an oak tree next to the White River. They dig them up, and these are the plates that are on, the images that were on the mysterious plates. He is the only one who can read the plates, and the plates, he explains that the plates tell him that he should be king of the Mormons.
Right.
I have one story in the newspaper that says that it was easy for them to know where to dig because Strang had just buried them the year before. All right. In 1847, he takes his clan to Beaver Island, a small island in upper Lake Michigan. And they lived there for a long time. That's where he gets elected to the Michigan legislature, of course, because the whole island is full of Mormons, all his supporters. That's also where he got shot in the back. Here's another crazy part about him. He was opposed to slavery. He wanted women and African Americans to have the right to be priests. He supported Native Americans. He was ecologically sensitive to forest preservation. Women should choose their polygamous mates rather than men choosing. And his oldest son, by his first wife, refused to lead the faithful, and that's how that whole group fell apart. All right, he's buried in Burlington, and when he died, wives Betsy and Phoebe took him back to Voree, to Burlington. Wives Elvira, Sarah, Phoebe, and Betsy were all pregnant when he died. What a crazy life. Another Lake Geneva story about the Newport of the West. And this is 1898, and this is a little small to read, but it says, dedicated to the wandering well-to-do, or Chicago, who seek country places. 1976, another book gets written, Lake Geneva, Newport of the West. But the first Newport in Wisconsin is up near the Dells. And it's still a township now called Newport up near the Dells in 1852. Kilbourne put tracks of his railroad several miles north, which meant that Newport would not thrive. So we lost it, but Newport is still a Columbia County township. This is what the houses look like in the Newport of the East. You may know what they look like in the West, in Lake Geneva. The only difference between the Newport of the East and the Newport of the West, in my mind, is that in the East, Providence, Rhode Island, you can't see the other shore because it's England. Here's one that is from Walworth County as well, Skunk's Hollow, or Skunk's Misery. There was a settler who tried to domesticate and raise skunks for fur. Aren't you glad you weren't his neighbor? Walworth township names are kind of interesting. Lafayette and LaGrange are two that I got a kick out of. Lafayette, of course, was a French military advisor who came to America and helped win the Revolutionary War. So I can guess why we call one of the townships Lafayette. LaGrange was his wife's castle in France. This is the castle, it still stands, the Chateau du LaGrange. All right, one more Walworth County. This is Troy. It's a little city called Troy. Remember, Wisconsin had 4 counties originally, right? Milwaukee, Brown, Crawford, and Iowa. We get farther on, and now we're Racine County and Kenosha County on the left, on the right, and Walworth County on the left. And Troy is the township up here. When it was organized, now here's that same township up here, named after Troy, New York, of course. When it was divided, Troy and West Troy were created in 1843. So now we have Troy and West Troy. Then West Troy was renamed Beecham's Prairie, and East Troy became East Troy. Beecham, however, didn't like the fact that one of the townships was named after him, so he went to the legislature and insisted that they change it to Troy. So East Troy and Troy became the way it was done. But Beecham was still the postmaster of the Troy post office, but he didn't want the township named after him. So if that's confusing, how about this? Troy Center is not in Troy, it's not in East Troy, and it's not in the center. There's Troy, East Troy, and Troy, and East Troy, and Troy Center, and Troy. All 3 are part of Walworth County. And this is the sign at the county park. You can come here if you live in the village or the towns of Troy and East Troy, otherwise not. Kenosha County, this is an interesting one just in terms of what we were in Wisconsin thinking about at this time. It was originally Gilead in 1844, but in 1848, the Wilmot proviso went through Congress, and that was an anti-slavery philosophy that said none of the states that we developed out of the Mexican War should ever carry slaves. So they changed their name to Wilmot so that there could be an anti-slave township in Kenosha County. Now, we might think of it as a ski resort now. It's owned by Vail, but they do skiing in Wilmot these days. DeForest came to town in 1854, and the history of the land ownership here is kind of interesting. Now, you may know that when you bought land from the government, you usually bought it at $1.25 an acre. 80 acres, $100, enough to raise a family, right? But that's what James Stephenson did. DeForest bought it all at $25 an acre. And so Stephenson made some money from 1845 to 1854, less than 10 years. His $1.25 turned into $25. And then DeForest says, well, now that I've got all this land, I'll divide it and sell the lots for $100 each. And so that's how DeForest got started. 100 Mile Grove. I was surprised to learn about this one. I'd lived in Madison for 20 years and never knew about this. There's a picture of the cemetery, the 100 Mile Grove Cemetery, and it's a little bit north of Dane. 100 miles from Fort Crawford. Remember right at the beginning we were talking about Wisconsin River as being one of the main highways in Wisconsin? Well, there's another main highway in Wisconsin that comes out of the Green Bay. It's the Fox River, right? So where are the first two forts in Wisconsin? Prairie du Chien. Well, the first one's Fort Howard in Green Bay. That's this way to you, I guess. And the second one is Fort Crawford in Prairie du Chien. And those two are connected by the Fox River and the Wisconsin River, except for a mile of dirt. Where? At the portage. Yes. Well, we'll come back to that a little later. But Starkweather Creek was interesting. Starkweather was a sergeant of arms bringing money from Milwaukee to Madison, but he got to Madison and he couldn't get over the creek, so he cut down some trees, made a bridge, stayed for a long time, and then decided to name the creek after him. Stoughton bought the land from Daniel Webster. I think this is the dictionary Daniel Webster because he was a land speculator and developed it for a village in 1847. How about the Four Lakes? Caganza, Wabisa, Monona, Mendota. For those of you who are counting, there is a fifth, of course, Lake Wingra, but it's not connected by the Catfish River. The Yahara, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So Wingra, Lake Zero, I call it, also a duck lake, according to the Ho-Chunk. Wabisa, Lake 2, Potawatomi calls it Wapishka, white foam, or Ojibwa, Wabisi, Swan Lake. Wabisi, Swan Lake. So it's a Ojibwe name. Mendota, I don't know what's your favorite image of Mendota, but these were three of mine. Went to school there, so of course the chairs at the Memorial Union are interesting. I was on campus when the Statue of Liberty was submerged the first time, 1979. And of course, I couldn't help but be fascinated by the canoes they found last summer in Lake Mendota. One 3,000 years old and one only 1,800 years old, I guess. But again, depending on which tribe of natives were here at the time, the lake might have been called Mendota as the mouth of the river. The Ho-Chunk called it Wankshiko-Mikla, where the man lies, and Potawatomi Manto-Ka, the snake maker. Monona, Lake 3, the Lost, Stolen, or Teepee Lake. Potawatomi called it the Wild Rice Lake, Man-O-Man, and the Sauk Fox called it the Superwoman or the Beautiful Lake. Here's the first lake, Caganza, and there's a paper city. This is kind of an interesting procedure. There were lots of land speculators who would buy a little bit of land, draw up a map like this. This is a complete map of a paper city that never existed, Washington Square, Jefferson Square, including here a railroad and steamboat depot on the map, but there's never been a city there. It was unsuccessful, as they speculated, for Lake Kaganza. Because it was drawn up on the west side, it would have been over here somewhere, and the Ojibwa called this one Gigons. And it isn't too hard to imagine getting from the word Gigon to Kiganza in terms of how it got named. And it means little fish. Now there is a resort on the west side of Kaganza called Crown Point. Any familiar with that? And this woman, a fisherman there, obviously didn't understand the name Little Fish when she got this northern. Winnebago, a little farther north. Sioux people, territory from northwest Illinois all the way up through Wisconsin. And they met Jean Nicolet the first time in 1634. And this is one of the postcards of that illustration of Nicolet landing in Green Bay, thinking he's in China, wearing his China robe. And of course, it's really an insensitive illustration these days with the Indians cowering in the background and he's shooting off his pistols. Very embarrassing. It was also made into a postal stamp at one point, so it was very popular. And another version of it is at the state capitol on the wall. There's a big mural. So it was a very popular idea to, of course, discover Wisconsin as if the people who were here needed discovering. Winnebago is from an Algonquin language, maybe Potawatomi, maybe Ojibwa, but the French explorers called it the people of the dirty water or the stinking water because Winnie is an Algonquin word that means stinking, that means water, and bago can mean strong smelling or salty or dirty. So you can begin to understand why the Winnebagos don't call themselves Winnebagos. They call themselves Ho-Chunk. Would you like to be known as the people of the stinking water or the proud voice, big voice? So that's how we make that difference. Now, Fort Winnebago is the fort in the middle. Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien, Fort, what's this way? Fort Howard in Green Bay, and we get to that portage in the middle, and Fort Winnebago is there, connecting the Fox and the Wisconsin. So here's an old French map. You have to know that the word renard means fox in French. And there goes a portage to get to the Wisconsin, spelling with a Q. And then there's another old map here that shows the 1 mile portage from the Fox to the Wisconsin. All right, let's finish this up. And we have time for some questions with another town in Lake Geneva in the alphabetical soup here called Zenda. Founded with the construction of the railroad, post office was established in 1902. And there are 5 Zendas in the United States, probably named after a popular story which became a movie in 1913, 1922, 37, 52, and so forth. One of the popular ones is James Mason and Deborah Kerr that I've watched. A movie about this story, this novel, also a cartoon classic, of course, of The Prisoner of Zenda. It's really a pretty simple story, so I'll go through it with you. In Central Europe, King Rudolph is to be crowned king, but he's drugged by his jealous half-brother Michael, so Michael can be king instead. Others persuade a visiting cousin, also named Rudolph, to impersonate the other Rudolph at the coronation, and he agrees to do that, but the drugged Rudolph is abducted and put in a castle in a small town of Zenda, which is the Polish word for prison. The imposter Rudolph falls in love with the Princess Flavia, who's to marry the real Rudolph. He doesn't tell her who he really is. After a sword fight, this has to be a sword fight in a movie like that, Rudolph rescues the real Rudolph. The real Rudolph is crowned. Sadly, the lovers, duty-bound, must part the end. And there's your story about the prisoner of Zenda and why Zenda, Wisconsin became named that. There's a story that says one of the founder's daughters was reading this story when the city was put together and the train came through town. And so that's how it came out. So, the question was, why do they call it that? Now you know. I brought 25 handouts. How about if I put them in the back? If you came with someone else, maybe just take one because we have more than I think 25 people here. And it has a list of some of the books you can go to find these kinds of stories and a few others, and a little bit of description of Black Point Estate as well. So I'll leave this in the back. Any thoughts or questions? Observations?
One of the hallmarks of New Linderman is that they don't know how to pronounce muscadet.
Muscadet, yeah. I'll bet. That would be good. Now that must be a native name. I'll put it on my list. It must be a native name, don't you think?
Oh, yeah.
It means morel mushrooms.
It does mean morale?
I'm just kidding. This is capital.
It's pretty believable.
It is the mushroom capital. Morel
Yeah,
mushroom.
that's right. They do a lot with mushrooms there. Muscadet. Yeah.
So you began with Oregon versus Oregon.
Uh-huh.
I live in Oregon and I've been to Oregon. And then later, when you were talking, I thought, oh, at least for me, light bulb went on, why we call it Oregon. It's how we say Wisconsin.
So it's that Wisconsin accent. The Wisconsin accent that we don't have.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
I don't know.
It could easily be that, yeah.
Yeah, it
Absolutely.
certainly tells people where you're from right away.
It's very different. If any of you are watching Yellowstone, for example, there is a Montana accent that's a little different than the Wisconsin. Wisconsin is not the same as Montana. Yeah, good observation. Yeah, good thought. Was there someone else who was going to share a thought? Yeah. I got to go back and find this lead trail you're talking about.
The chairs that were at the Union Institute show there,
Yeah.
they were made here in Oregon.
Oh, were they?
They are.
Oh, still are, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good fact. If it's okay with you, I'm going to add that.
Oh, right.
Yeah. The starburst or sunburst chairs, yeah.
Yeah, I used to stamp them out. I worked at Wisco Industries here in
Did
town.
you get to sign the back of all of them?
I just hit the buttons and
They were just chairs.
bang.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right.
Waukesha, any history about that name?
I have not pursued Waukesha at this point, so no, I don't think I know much about Waukesha. But the handout has books where you can go and find some of that. There's 2 or 3 standard books. Robert Gard did one called The Romance of Place Names. And there's 2 editions of that, and you can also get that online at your library probably, if you want to do it that way. And the other standard one is Callie, I think his last name is. Yeah, Edward Callie, Place Names of Wisconsin. But many of these stories came from lots of other little places when you start to pursue these things as well. But those are 2 standard books that you can start with.
One of the French towns you noted up there was Eau Claire. I used to live in Eau Claire. I never found out what that actually means.
Yeah, I wonder. What's the translation of Eau Claire?
Wouldn't it be clear water?
This is.
Yep.
Clear water?
Yeah.
That would make sense. Yeah. Well, all right. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate it.